More than 20 Russian motorcycle riders were thrown into an assault that was supposed to confuse Ukraine, split its attention, and open a path through the defensive line. But this was not a simple rush across open ground. This time, the Russian unit broke into several small groups, with one group acting as bait, another moving toward the flank, and a third waiting behind to exploit any Ukrainian mistake. That made the attack more dangerous than a normal motorcycle charge. Russia was not only trying to use speed, it was trying to trap Ukrainian snipers and drones into reacting too early. If Ukraine fired at the first visible group, Russian commanders hoped the second group could slip through the gap. But the battlefield in Ukraine has changed. A motorcycle may be smaller than a tank, and a scattered unit may look harder to hit than a BMP column. Yet from above, every turn, every pause, and every split in the formation can become a clue. What followed was not just an ambush. It was a contest between a Russian deception plan and a Ukrainian target hunting network. The snipers did not shoot first. The FPV drones did not dive first. The Reconnaissance UAV simply watched as the entire Russian plan began to reveal itself. And that raises the real question. If Russia had already changed the way it used motorcycles, why did the attack still move toward disaster? Russia changed the shape of the assault because a straight motorcycle charge had become too easy to read. Instead of sending more than 20 riders down one route, the unit broke into 3 smaller groups before moving toward the Ukrainian line. The first group took the most visible path, moving fast across the ground where Ukrainian observers were most likely to look first. From a distance, this group looked like the main attack. That was the point. Its job was to draw attention, force a quick Ukrainian reaction, and make the defenders reveal where the first shots would come from. Behind that visible push, the second group moved with a different purpose. It shifted toward the flank, using tree lines, shallow ditches, and narrow dirt tracks to stay away from the obvious route. These riders were not trying to win the race across open ground alone. They were trying to reach a weaker angle while Ukrainian snipers and drone crews focused on the bait group in front. The third group stayed farther back, holding enough distance to react to whatever happened next. If the first riders found a gap, this rear element could rush forward and add weight to the attack. If Ukrainian snipers fired too early, the group could try to identify the firing area and move toward the exposed point. If the flank group reached cover, the rear riders could support the new line of pressure. This was not the old version of a motorcycle assault, where speed alone carried the plan. It was a layered move built around timing, pressure, and confusion. Russian commanders were trying to make Ukraine choose too quickly. Shoot the first group, and the flank might open. Wait too long, and the side element could get close enough to threaten a trench, a firing point, or a narrow supply path behind the first defensive position. Before the riders fully committed, Russian reconnaissance UAVs moved low enough to search for signs of danger. They looked for Ukrainian drone teams, possible sniper hides, FPV launch points, and small observation posts that might be hidden near tree lines or broken ground. The Russian side was not blind. It knew that any movement near the front could be watched, and it tried to locate the eyes before the main push entered the most dangerous zone. But that scouting also carried risk. Every reconnaissance pass told Ukraine something about the direction of interest. Every low drone movement pointed toward the routes Russia cared about most. The more Russia checked one area, the more that area began to look like the future path of the assault. The battlefield was quiet on the surface, but both sides were already reading each other before the first motorcycle reached the open lane. For the riders, the plan depended on rhythm. The bait group had to move boldly enough to pull attention. The flank group had to stay hidden long enough to matter. The rear group had to wait without losing the moment to exploit confusion. If all 3 parts worked together, Ukraine could be forced into a difficult choice under pressure. Russia wanted the defenders to fire at the wrong moment, reveal the wrong position, and open the wrong space. But the plan carried one hidden weakness. The 3 groups could only support each other if Ukraine reacted exactly as expected. If Ukrainian UAVs stayed patient and watched the whole pattern instead of chasing the first visible targets, the divided formation could become easier to separate than to stop all at once. That is where the real battle began. Ukraine understood that the most visible target was not necessarily the most important one. The first motorcycle group appeared exactly where Russian planners wanted it to appear. The riders moved along the route that was easiest to see from the air and from forward observation positions. From the Russian perspective, this was the group most likely to trigger a reaction. A sniper shot, an FPV launch, or even a sudden change in Ukrainian radio activity could reveal where the defense was watching from. But the expected reaction never came. Ukrainian Reconnaissance UAVs picked up the movement early and followed it without calling in immediate fire. The motorcycles continued forward, yet the drone operators seemed more interested in what was happening around the group than in the riders themselves. Cameras tracked spacing between elements, measured the distance separating one group from another, and watched how the routes slowly began to diverge across the battlefield. As the motorcycles pushed deeper, the aerial picture became clearer. One formation continued on the obvious approach. Another gradually shifted away from the main axis and moved toward terrain that offered more concealment. That realization changed the mission. Instead of preparing to stop a charge, Ukrainian operators focused on understanding the structure behind it. The battle was no longer about destroying motorcycles as quickly as possible. It was about identifying which group mattered most and determining how the different elements were supposed to support one another. On the ground, sniper teams received the same instruction. Hold fire. The order may have seemed strange. Some of the motorcycles were already moving through areas where a skilled marksman could attempt a shot. Yet one rifle report at the wrong moment could reveal a firing position that had taken hours to prepare. Russian reconnaissance drones were still searching, and a single mistake could turn the hunters into targets. Patience created opportunity. As the flank group moved farther from the primary route, Ukrainian UAV operators noticed something important. These riders were not simply avoiding danger. They were following terrain features that could eventually place them behind the area where the first contact was expected. The movement suggested that the visible group was serving another purpose. It was attracting attention while a second element attempted to approach from a less obvious direction. That was the confirmation Ukraine had been waiting for. A sniper team was quietly repositioned toward a section of ground that the flank riders would eventually have to cross. It was not a long stretch of open terrain, but it was one of the few places where concealment disappeared and movement became predictable. The team settled into position and waited. Elsewhere, an FPV crew prepared for a different task. Rather than targeting the leading motorcycles, the operators focused on the route behind the assault. If the rear group tried to rush forward after contact began, that route could become far more valuable than the first point of attack. The battlefield remained unusually quiet. No drones dove toward the motorcycles. No sniper rounds cut through the air. No sudden artillery strike interrupted the advance. From the Russian side, the plan may have appeared to be working. The bait group continued moving. The flank element advanced. The reserve force remained available. Nothing suggested that the deception had failed. But the silence was misleading. Ukraine was not trying to break the trap immediately. It was allowing the plan to develop because every additional minute exposed more of the assault. And once that picture was complete, the next move would not target the most obvious riders. It would target the part of the formation that least expected to be seen. The first real strike did not hit the group Russia wanted Ukraine to notice. The bait riders were still moving on the more visible route when the flank group reached the critical point. For several minutes, that side element had used cover well enough to keep its movement less obvious from ground level. Trees broke the line of sight. Shallow ground hid parts of the bikes, and the narrow dirt track allowed the riders to avoid the open lane that looked more dangerous. Then the terrain changed. The flank group had to leave the edge of the trees and cross a short exposed strip before reaching the next section of cover. It was not a wide field, and it may have looked like a small risk from the saddle of a motorcycle. But from the Ukrainian side, this was the exact place where the movement became predictable. The riders could not spread out much. They could not stop without blocking the path. They had to pass through one after another. That was when the sniper team fired. The lead rider of the flank group went down at the worst possible point. The motorcycle lost control and cut across the narrow track, forcing the riders behind him to react in a space where reaction time was almost gone. The second bike braked hard. The third tried to swing around the obstacle. Dust rose from the ground, and the side route that had been chosen for concealment suddenly became a tight channel with no clean exit. The next blow came from the air. An FPV drone moved in while the group was still trying to recover from the first impact. The strike landed near the front of the stalled group, and the explosion turned a moment of confusion into a physical blockage. Now the flank group was no longer a hidden threat. It was trapped between the cover it had just left and the exposed ground it could no longer cross. That single change broke the purpose of the bait group. The riders on the visible route were supposed to pull Ukrainian fire toward themselves. Instead, they heard the fight begin somewhere else. The noise came from the side, not from the direction they expected. The plan had counted on Ukraine reacting to the obvious target, but the obvious target had been ignored. Some of the bait riders tried to save the attack by accelerating. They pushed forward, hoping to force Ukraine to shift attention back to the main route. But that movement created a new problem. They began to move too far ahead of the flank element, and the distance between the groups widened. What had been planned as a connected assault started to split into separate pieces moving at different speeds. Behind them, the third group received orders to move. This rear element was supposed to exploit confusion, but the situation was already unclear. The assault was no longer one coordinated plan. It became three small emergencies at once. From above, Ukrainian drones could now track each branch separately, and that gave the defenders more control than they had at the start. Russia had divided the motorcycles to confuse Ukraine. But once the flank group was hit first, that division became a weakness. Each group lost the protection of the others, and the battle turned against the very idea that had shaped the assault. Russia tried to recover control by attacking the Ukrainian kill chain, not just the Ukrainian firing positions. Once the flank group was stopped and the assault began to lose shape, Russian commanders needed a short opening. The motorcycles in the forward area could not wait for a slow rescue plan, and the rear element could not move safely while Ukrainian drones still held the sky above the route. The response came in several layers at once. First, Russian reconnaissance drones moved toward the area where the FPV strikes had appeared. Their purpose was not only to find the drone operators. They also tried to force Ukrainian crews to look upward and shift attention away from the trapped motorcycle groups below. A drone that suddenly appears above a firing sector can change the rhythm of a fight, especially if the defender believes artillery may follow. Then the decoys appeared. Small drones and false targets were sent into the same airspace where Ukrainian FPV teams had been active. The aim was to pull Ukrainian strike drones away from the real rescue route, waste their batteries, and make operators choose between several moving objects at once. At nearly the same time, a local jamming system was activated around the area where the motorcycles were stuck. Its purpose was simple: break the link between Ukrainian FPV drones and their controllers, even if only for a few minutes. That small window could be enough for Russian survivors to crawl back, for a buggy to rush forward, or for the rear motorcycle group to reorganize without being hit immediately. The jamming had some effect. A few Ukrainian drones appeared to change course or delay their approach. The sniper team also slowed its pace, not because it had lost the fight, but because Russian reconnaissance and possible artillery pressure made every shot more dangerous. A sniper position that fires too often can become a target. In this phase, both sides were trying to avoid revealing too much while still acting fast enough to shape the next move. But the Russian rescue effort created a new problem. As soon as commanders began sending orders to the rear, more radio traffic moved through the battlefield. Ukrainian FPV operators noticed the change. Their attention shifted from the motorcycles already hit to the ground behind them. A light truck moved from behind a tree line. A buggy followed. Several reserve motorcycles started to roll out from the same concealed area. That movement revealed the rescue route. Ukraine did not strike the first vehicle as soon as it appeared. The decision was colder than that. If the first truck was destroyed too early, the rest could reverse into cover and disappear before the trap widened. So the FPV kept watching. The vehicles were allowed to leave the protection of the trees, gather on the shared track, and commit to the same road that the motorcycles had already exposed. For Russia, the jamming window looked like a chance to save men and restore pressure. For Ukraine, it became a way to identify the second layer of the assault. The rescue had started before the attack was truly over, and that urgency forced more equipment into view. The battle was now changing again. It was no longer only about the riders caught near the flank. The support vehicles, the reserve motorcycles, and the rear staging area were beginning to enter the same target network that had already broken the first part of the plan. Ukraine turned the rescue attempt into the final stage of the ambush. When the support vehicles moved forward, the Ukrainian FPV teams changed their priority. The main targets were no longer only the riders scattered near the flank route. The first vehicle in the rescue line became more important because it controlled the movement of everything behind it. If that vehicle stopped, the narrow track would close, and the entire recovery effort could lose speed in seconds. The FPV strike came as the lead vehicle entered the tightest part of the route. It was already committed, and it had little room to turn. The drone hit hard enough to stop the vehicle on the track, leaving smoke and debris in the path of the buggy and reserve motorcycles behind it. The following drivers had to brake, slow down, or search for space along the edge of the road. That pause changed the battlefield again. The trapped soldiers saw the support line and began moving toward it. Some came from the flank group, where the first strike had broken the side approach. Others came from the bait group, which had pushed too far ahead and now had no clear role. They moved in small clusters toward the same area, using wrecked bikes, shallow holes, and the edge of the trees as temporary cover. From above, that movement was impossible to hide for long. The Ukrainian FPV followed the clusters as they formed, but the sniper team did not rush every shot. It chose targets that could affect the remaining order inside the Russian force. A man trying to direct others became a higher priority than a man lying still. A soldier dragging a wounded rider exposed both his own movement and the location of the group around him. A figure waving others toward the rescue vehicle showed where command was trying to return. The FPV crews then worked the vehicles that had lost speed. A buggy trying to turn around became exposed from the side. A motorcycle that slowed near the burning lead vehicle became easier to track. A light truck attempting to push around the blockage had to leave the cleaner part of the path and move toward uneven ground, where speed dropped and control became weaker. Each delay gave the drone operators a better angle. The rescue column was no longer saving the assault. It was becoming part of the same target pattern. At the same time, the Reconnaissance UAV began following the route backward. The line of movement led away from the wrecked vehicles and toward the place where the support group had first emerged. That rear area now mattered more than before. It was not just a hiding point. It was the source of the rescue vehicles, reserve riders, radio orders, and possibly the next attempt to recover the trapped men. If Ukrainian artillery or longer-range drones were ready, that staging area could become the next target. Even without an immediate strike, the fact that it had been identified changed the risk for Russia. Vehicles that had been kept out of sight were now connected to the failed assault by their own movement. The most dangerous part was not only the loss of motorcycles. The original path had turned into a map, leading Ukraine deeper into the Russian support system. Every rescue movement, every radio call, and every vehicle leaving cover added another clue. By the end of the sequence, the assault corridor had lost its purpose. It had become a reverse trail from the front back to the Russian staging area, and Ukraine had followed that trail with drones, snipers, and FPV strikes until the operation could no longer recover. This fight was dangerous because Russia did not repeat the simplest version of a motorcycle assault. It tried to adapt. The riders were divided into 3 groups. The plan was clear. Force Ukraine to fire too early, expose the sniper teams, pull FPV drones away from the main route, and then push another group through the space that opened. But Ukraine did not take the bait. The Reconnaissance UAV watched the full pattern instead of chasing the first visible targets. The snipers stayed silent until the flank group entered the most vulnerable ground. Then FPV drones turned stalled vehicles, rescue movement, and the rear support route into a second layer of targets. What began as a Russian deception plan became a map of Russian movement. That is the deeper warning. Snipers are no longer just hidden shooters waiting for one clean shot. In this kind of war, they are part of a larger system that controls timing. Drones are not only flying weapons, they are the eyes that decide when silence is more valuable than fire. So the question remains open. Can Russia hide its split attacks better? Or is Ukraine showing that even a clever deception plan can become a trap in the drone age? If this breakdown helped you see the battlefield more clearly, like the video, share it with someone who follows this war, and subscribe to Military Force for more analysis of the weapons, battles, and decisions shaping modern warfare.